So the last topic that we discussed in the first politics podcast was like race and discrimination, and at this point in my research I was getting like kind of exhausted, so I didn't have like a ton of stuff written down for this, but I know like people look at Trump as racist or like a white supremacist, and I don't know, like, is this something that I don't like pay attention to all the debates, or you know, I can't keep up with all the stuff that's going on with like the two candidates, but is this something that he's like saying in his like is he saying this stuff in his debates? Is he saying this, or is this just kind of a made up thing because he's a white guy that
I think maybe I would say that one of the best ways to approach that, the whole topic of politics relative to race, is this. Pretty much everybody, including Trump, is going to say nowadays that we're not overtly racist. In other words, you know, the position that everybody holds to is that, you know, all people have equal, let's say, dignity, equal value under God, that kind of position, which ironically I would argue historically came out of Christianity. Before Christianity, that was not the case, as ironically Elon Musk talked about, that, you know, it's historic for everybody to either be a slave or a slaveholder. Like that's you know, if you go back far enough in time, that's what you find. The concern relative to the political parties and race right now is probably about this idea of like diversity, equity, and inclusion, or kind of like reparations for people who had, you know, their lineage had been in slavery or this kind of thing. And that the Democratic stance on some of that is that, like, kind of because of what has happened in the past, we need to go over and above and, let's say, have easier entrance requirements for black people into colleges, or we need to, you know, have hiring quotas that fill a certain percentage of jobs with people of different races or ethnicities, that kind of thing. Whereas the Republican position would hold more to like if we're going to treat everybody with equal dignity, let's like honor humans in whatever race they're from by requiring the same kind of level playing field for anybody regardless of their race. And one person I particularly appreciate on this topic is a guy named Thomas Sowell. He's a black man. I think he has been a professor at maybe Stanford, some prestigious college. He's old now, like 90s, I want to say, still writing. And he has some really helpful things as a black person to say on this. And he would lean more towards the conservative side to say we're not treating people well when we kind of like lower a bar for them to get into college or to get jobs or whatever. So that's one way to think about it. Another thing that's really strong to me is I love Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. If people have not read that, I would highly encourage people. It's a one-page deal to read that, because he, you know, even I Have a Dream speech, that kind of thing, his position, which would fit, I think, relatively well with the Republican side nowadays, is very much on the side of like the vision is that we judge people. In that speech he says judge people by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. And so I think there's goodness to come out of that. Now I also lived in Philly for 6 years, as I said before, and worked at a primarily African American school. Had a lot like I was a minority in a realm that was not Mifflin County, I'll say it that way. And so for me, that experience helped me to see that there's probably some correction that I needed to have relative to just assumptions or ways that even without thinking, I kind of grew up with some level of unhealth when it comes to race. That I was especially really challenged when I ran into several like black Christian people that they were way more impressive than me. Like I was just so impressed with those people.
Yeah.
I respected them, loved them. And that helped me to see that, like, it wasn't like, oh, what am I doing to theoretically help these poor black folks? But instead, like, there's plenty of black people that are, I think, growing up under harder circumstances than I ever did, and have come out of that in much healthier ways. And so, as always, there's corrections on both sides. There's other things I could talk about, like slavery oftentimes comes up. It's a weird dynamic because Christianity was on both sides because it was white Southern Christians mostly who were slaveholders in the type of slavery that happened in America. But it was also white Christian politicians, mainly in England. William Wilberforce. People never saw the movie Amazing Grace. It details kind of the story of them, ending slavery as an institution, or beginning to end slavery as an institution in the world, which was done precisely because they were Christians. So I can say more about any of that stuff if either of you have any questions, but that's a couple thoughts about race and politics. You can keep thinking of questions if you have them, but I had these in my notes just to mention, put them out there. One is I always like to say that Jesus was not white. He wasn't of European descent. He probably didn't have blue eyes and long blonde hair like a lot of pictures of him have. So that's just wrong. Also, this matters to me, is Christianity is the most geographically diverse religion in the world. In other words, Hinduism, Islam mostly happen within people of similar ethnicities, whereas Christianity started in the Middle East, is booming in Africa and Asia right now, was really high in Europe and North America. Both are on the decline now. Decent in Australia. Like, the idea is that the Bible is very, very clear. You read the book of Jonah, the book of Galatians, Acts chapter 10. So much of the Bible is written about this question of, like, how do we find unity for people who are different ethnically before God? And so the Bible is super aware of the challenges, but it speaks into them in lots of different ways that I think in our cultural discussions about race, people don't commonly think about that, you know? Mm-hmm. It's like, to me, if God made everybody, then everybody, regardless of color, has dignity. And then also, if God made everybody, then we all show up at the same starting point. If we're all sinners, you know, it's not like one race is bad and one race is superior. Like, you can't say that if you believe in the gospel.
Yeah, and I think there was a list that Kylie had showed me that, like, had different political issues and said, like, whether Trump and Kamala agree or disagree with those issues. And one of them, the only issue that they agreed on was financial support for historically black colleges, which I thought was interesting. That was the only topic that they both agreed on. So
I guess there's a starting point or something like that to a conversation about what may help. Yeah. I when I taught in Philly, a lot of the students I taught went to historically black colleges. I wasn't even aware really of that whole deal growing up in Mifflin County. Yeah. And so, yeah, it'd be great if help them. They were cool kids. Yeah. My biggest encouragement is check out Letter from a Birmingham Jail. Check out Amazing Grace about the story of William Wilberforce. Read the book of Galatians or the book of Jonah or Acts, I think it's 10 or 10 and 11. And just maybe I'd encourage people to think through what the Bible and what Christianity actually says about race, other than just what you think of how Christians think about it. So
I have a couple questions that I want to ask, or even statements, I guess.
Fire away, Callie.
The list that I was talking about, or showed Fern, it had on there that Harris is against freedom of religion. Mm-hmm. And then my question is, how could that affect us if she were to get into office? And don't you think that would kind of make it clear on who to vote for if you can't even choose what to believe in?
Yeah, I think my sense is, Kylie, I probably have a little bit of a surprising answer to this, which is that I don't really think freedom of religion is something that can, like, technically, like, people cannot, they can attempt to limit outward expressions of freedom of religion. But there's plenty of places in the world right now, either historically or currently. You know, you're an early Christian in Rome, and you express that you're a Christian, and they pull you in and, you know, feed you some lions or put you in with the gladiators or something like that. Like, they didn't have freedom of religion, and Christianity boomed. I think I'm thinking of Corrie ten Boom book, which is awesome, Hiding Place, talks about how she was a Christian in Nazi Germany, and she still wanted to be a Christian, and they did things secretly. They helped Jewish people on the down low. They got in trouble. She got sent to POW camp. They had a revival in the POW camp. Like, I don't think that God can be stopped, and I don't think that we should necessarily fear kind of a lack of freedom of religion. I think, obviously America has historically kind of been founded on this premise that, like, everyone gets treated with dignity and there's room for anyone to express their faith, whatever, which over time, especially as America has gone through times where we've had revivals and been like a significantly Christian country, I think has served us really well. There's a reason why a lot of people want to come to America. There's a reason why, people think that in America they're going to, why are people coming across the border? They want to be treated well, and the hope is that America wants to treat people well because of our Christian heritage. I think oftentimes about what it looks like to pastor or lead a church, or think about the church in the future if some of the stuff you're describing happens. It's not like something I'm like signing up for, like, yippee, that'll be super fun. But I do think that is, it has potential, not just because it feels like it has a potential now, but also because at various times in various places around the world, like, that is the reality for people who are Christians. Mm-hmm. Is there an environment where there's no freedom for them to be a Christian, but they're still a Christian anyhow? And so I don't personally put that as like the highest thing on my priority list. I think if Christians would represent Christ well in the way that we're supposed to, and we would be others focused, and we would serve the least of these while at the same time upholding personally morality in our own lives and stuff like that, I think it would help. I think my kids, my wife and I's parenting of them is hopefully around this idea that, like, you have the freedom to believe in God, and if somebody tells you no, like, you don't have to listen to that. Like, you can still pray. You can still, figure out a way to read a Bible and think about Jesus. So that's not the end all be all to me. Do I think it's not ideal? Yeah, probably. It's not ideal to, like, limit the freedom, but I'm curious because Christianity has historically boomed when it's been on the fringes or had to, like, represent itself most authentically, whereas some people say, like, not gotten too close to cultural power, because Christianity is a place of giving up power for the good of others. So,
I kind of have a question regarding
Yep.
that. Is this whole, like, freedom of religion, is this something that only Christians would face, or would Islam and Muslim and all them also have, like, because you said historically we've struggled, or we've had this issue before. Mm-hmm. Has it only been Christianity, or has it been other religions as well? It's
been other religions. I mean, you can talk about the ups and downs of the Crusades, which were kind of Christianity against Muslim, trying to, like, limit freedom and kind of use violence to achieve a certain purpose on both sides of that. In the Crusades, I think it's interesting to me because what a lot of people would say nowadays is that freedom of religion actually means there can be any way to get to God, which I would say is not actually freedom of religion, because at that point you're saying you're the only person who knows the right way to get to God, which is anyway, and anybody who's an idiot who only thinks there's one way to get to God, like, they're wrong. And so you're doing the same thing that you think those people are doing, and so it's like this double standard, or it backfires intellectually, that argument. And so my opinion is Christianity works the best in this. Like, it can do the best because Christianity says that the reason we get to God is not because of anything we've earned, but because of what God has done for us. And so that allows us fundamentally to be gracious towards people who have other belief. Mm-hmm. Whereas if your belief is you need to do X, Y, and Z to get God to like you, then you have to feel the need to punish or to make sure everybody's doing X, Y, and Z to get God to like them. And so I think Christianity is just unique in how it represents. You don't do something to get God to like you. God likes you. God did something because he likes you, because he loves you, because he wants your good. And so that's not exactly answering your question precisely, but I think that's why Christianity is unique when it comes to this.
Okay.
Your question.
Yeah.
Another question that I have was, Jesus never really supported or support people's sins. Like, he always hung out with the tax collectors or the prostitutes or etc. And he loves us, and he cares about us, and he roots for us and wants us. But don't you think, like, obviously the importance of voting, like, in who we vote for, like, wouldn't that like show of what we support? Like, we don't want to, like, I feel like if we voted for Harris, we would be showing that we're supporting, obviously, the evilness and the less Jesus-like. Obviously, yeah, Trump is evil in his own ways too, but he is the lesser of the two evils. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I think, like I said earlier, that when I see, to the best I can, when I see people, I try to see every person as this combination of the unhealth that they have and the health that they have. And so, I don't know if it's, I'm a previous math teacher, so sometimes I think of it as percentages or something like that. I don't know if that's accurate. But, like, I don't want to demonize Kamala Harris. I don't love the idea of, like, using funny nicknames to kind of belittle or berate or mock or that kind of thing. Like, she is a human that God created.
Yeah.
And worth inherent, like, the Christian position historically and just the gospel theologically is that worth dignity, and I still have the freedom to disagree with a lot of positions she holds, because I think in a lot of ways, and this goes back to some of the stuff I said about the foster care concept and different things, like, I don't think that her positions are always promoting having that same dignity for all life, let's say, to put it simply. Trump, on the other hand, is like, there's some positions that I really appreciate that I appreciate to some extent. Like, I think it's good that he promoted justices that overturned Roe versus Wade. Like, I think that's a good thing. I also think it just isn't good to have biological men, compete against women in sport. Like, there's just things that I don't think are good. However, I also don't want to say that I don't think it's ideal that he's, married to his third wife, and that he, some things about his personal life, like, he's not Jesus, none of us are. Yeah. And so for me, where that lands me, Kylie, is that, like, if you only think the hope going forward is in voting, it kind of leaves you in a bad place, because it's like, as we've been saying in this podcast, like, lesser of two evils is a thing, or whatever, however you want to phrase that. But I just think in every way I can, with my kids, with my family, with the church, in the community that I'm in, and the relationships that I am in, to promote Jesus as the ultimate solution, and vote in a way that is going to hope to move Jesus's movement forward, in the best way possible. I think that's important. But I also, this is just the gray gospel world that I tend to live in, which is not gray in the sense that the gospel is gray, but gray in the sense of, like, every person is a combination of good and bad. Only Christ is completely good, and that in some time in the future, the idea of the end of the book of Revelation is that we'll all live in this perfect situation, and we'll just be, like, so impressed by how awesome it is. And the only way we got there is because of what Jesus did for us. Yeah. Not because we voted right, but hopefully we'll look back on our lives. I want to look back on my life and say, like, I did everything I could to get as many people to experience that as possible, as well as to make Earth now as much like what God wants it to be as I can.
Something that I wanted to bring up to you, it's not really a question, I just want to hear your thoughts on it, but, like, we haven't talked about it yet in this podcast, but I think a lot of Christians are getting wound up right now over this whole Kamala Harris rally, and someone said, like, two college kids yelled, Jesus is Lord, and she said, oh, you're at the wrong rally. And then the same type of thing happened when J.D. Vance, which is Donald Trump's vice president pick, somebody yelled, Jesus is king, and he, like, stopped what he was saying, and he, like, said, yes, Jesus is king, and then he continued. I think that's something that Christians are getting a little wound up about right now. I was just curious to hear what maybe you had to say about that.
Yeah, I just thought of this passage that I think relates. Yeah, so first off, I think, I don't think that's ideal of Kamala to say that kind of thing. I don't think it's a good thing to say. I think that, you know, the gospel, as the best I can understand it, is that Jesus is Lord, and our best life is lived in submission to that one single fact. So I personally take that real seriously. I'm also thinking about the passage where it says, Jesus talks about how many of the end times will say, Lord, Lord. This is Matthew 25. You can look it up when you're in if you want. Matthew 25 is this really awesome parable of the sheep and the goats. And this whole story about how people said, like, the idea is that I'll give a whole sermon here, but basically, different groups at the end time said, God said to them, like, either you are or are not, part of God's kingdom because you did or didn't treat me well. That's what Jesus says. And read and think about the passage. You'll get it in more detail than I have time for now. It's not that I don't know it. I just don't want to take all the time. The concept, really, the fundamental idea of that is that the way people were living, like, it doesn't matter what words you say if those words don't match your actions. And so I think, like, it's very unhealthy for anyone to say, Lord, Lord, and prophesy and talk about God, how much you love God, and not act in the same, like, it's unhealthy just to say those words and not want to do that. It's also, though, unhealthy to use those words but not act in a way that represents those words. And so my biggest thing of this whole podcast is, like, trying to call people who either are Christians or want to be Christians or are curious about how Christianity is viewed, is that the Christian view is to live those words out rightfully. I think it's good to say them. Like, I talk about Jesus as being Lord a lot, in church and sermons and stuff. But if we're not living them out well, then there's biblical precedent to the fact that people can say words without responding to them with their actions. So it's dismissive. I saw the clip you're talking about. It's dismissive of Kamala to say that. It really goes back to the same point I made earlier, which is, if people kind of hold their high horse of, I can get to God either through following democratic policies or by, any road gets you to God as long as I'm a nice person, this kind of stuff. Ultimately, all of that is still self-serving. It still puts ourselves as the key way to get to God. The only way, the Christian way, is fundamentally different than that, which is Jesus is Lord and I'm not, which takes a certain amount of humility, both lived out and spoken about, I think.